Good evening and welcome. It's a great pleasure to welcome David Chipperfield back to the GSD. I was just looking at some notes of the school. David was here teaching an option studio the last time I think in 1987. So it's been a long time, and I hope this is now the first of many, many future visits. The last few years have been really, I think, extraordinary times for David and his firm. David has a practice that is now primarily based in London and Berlin and in Milan and Shanghai. But there was a time when one could sort of hear David complaining about the fact that he had been working in the UK for a long time, and there were really no projects in the UK, and he was very much recognized as an architect in Europe, probably in terms of larger scale projects, before he got to do projects in London and other places. But I think those times have changed. And with that transformation has come incredible recognition. Again, over the past few years, he's become a Royal Academician. He received the Order of Merit in Germany, the RIBA Gold Medal, the Stirling Award. A couple of weeks ago, another prize in Germany, and the Mies van der Rohe Award for this building that you see here on the screen, the Neues Museum in Berlin, which is really part of a whole series of transformations of existing buildings and new building that has been taking place for over 10 years and will continue very much into the future. I was lucky enough, as part of the Mies van der Rohe jury this year, to go around and see the work of a lot of European architects. And of course, the museum was also shortlisted. And it's really extraordinary to see the incredible attention to detail, the level of creativity that exists in terms of both building, the idea of transforming existing conditions, renovating existing conditions, and really building new things in the context of historic buildings. And the variations and the quality of those, plus the fact that, in a way, as a museum, David is also, and his practice, are dealing with the construction of the interior of the museum, which has to be, in terms of displays, of the same kind of caliber. It's possible to go on for a long time, and I want to have all the time for David, but I think it's fair to say that many of the qualities that you would see in the vast number of projects that are being developed throughout the world, in the United States, in Europe, and other places, in a way have their history and genealogy to some of the very first projects. If you go back to the house that David did in the apartment in 1984, and really a key project, which is the interior that he did for Issey Miyake in London, those kinds of qualities have been there. It's not, of course, many things have changed, but that commitment to design, to imagination, it's been there from the very beginning. The work, in many ways, is very respectful of history, but it's very much rooted in the traditions of modernity. And I think David's own trajectory as an architect and his relationship and collaboration with a number of people in England is a very interesting history. But I think in many ways the work also has a very strong European connection. I think somewhere, I know that David quotes Alvaro Siza, who is been, I think, a lot of times one of the references and influences for him, who talks about the idea in architecture that there is familiarity, but there is also a shock. And this idea of certain things that seem of the everyday, that seem of the familiar, but at the same time, they're not. There is some very strong sense of a difference, of a shock in them. And the kind of jolt that produces is something that has always been present in the work in terms of having a certain sense of continuity, but really also an incredible sense of how you create variation and difference. I'm looking forward to the presentation. I know that it's going to be wonderful. Please join me in welcoming David Chipperfield.
Thank you, Mohsen. Well, you've given me, thank you very much. Yeah, the idea of familiarity is certainly something I want to talk about, and in a way, to talk about the approach that we have about architecture. I will talk mostly about this project, Mies Museum, and it is a complicated project, so I need a certain amount of time to it. But I want to embed it in a slightly wider discussion. Otherwise, it seems that our work is about restoring bombed buildings in Berlin, which is not really the case. But when I started this project, when I did imagine that maybe I had 10 years of restoration work, I hadn't really thought that it could be so symptomatic, or that it would teach us so many things. I mean, it has become a really important work, not on the periphery of our office, but really in the center. So my lecture is in two parts. Firstly, I want to give a short overview on how we approach architecture, and secondly, I want to describe in detail the reconstruction of the Mies Museum in Berlin. Bridging these two sections, I want to talk about the new entrance building for the Berlin Museum Island, now known as the James Simon Gallery, which is currently under construction. I would like to show, through the images and description, our approach to architecture and where we look for ideas. I don't intend to explain these projects in any depth, but I'd like to explain how we think about architecture. Obviously, every architectural project has many concerns, and each project is ordered by issues that are practical and economic as well as philosophical. That is the nature of architecture. That is what makes it relevant and what makes it different from sculpture, painting, or poetry. We naturally tend to discuss architecture in terms of what it looks like, while we increasingly abandon our interest in what it feels like. In doing so, we undervalue architecture's most extraordinary potential, that of physical experience, of being within architecture. In a world so dominated by image and novelty, where our attention span is so reduced, the understanding and appreciation of the qualities of the tangible, the material, and the substantial is increasingly overlooked. Inevitably, architecture is commissioned on the basis of promise. Architects receive their commissions on what they say a building will be. Technology gives us more opportunity to visualize our proposals. A preliminary stage of design, and encourages us to develop our ideas visually. For it is visually that it will be judged. In no way do I wish to undervalue the importance of a building's visual qualities, only to point out that in our image-obsessed culture, we tend to underestimate meaning and substance. A brief overview and, in a way, a story about where my attitude to architecture comes from. My first opportunities to build came in Japan. In a society rather free of attitudes of what buildings should look like, I took the chance to experiment with a modernist interest of abstraction, with the exploitation of section, and with the idea of architectural promenade. I was quite shocked to arrive in Kyoto, first of all, and discover a city that wasn't, made of temples and beautiful spaces. In fact, in Japan, the public space, is really not considered, and instead, buildings tend to be introverted and isolated. But it was a strange experience to really do one's first buildings in a culture that wasn't one's own. But as they were the first buildings, it gave me an opportunity to, in a way, practice one's sort of modernist preoccupations. But it was confusing to be developing ideas outside of one's own culture. And I was concerned to follow ideas that helped to locate these projects within their context. I was obviously influenced by the work of Tadao Ando, who also offered me practical help in the realization of this building. I explored the ideas associated with traditional Japanese architecture, a highly selective and exaggerated exclusion and inclusion of context, and an articulated ambiguity of enclosed interior and exterior space. My experience in Japan confirmed my interest in pursuing an elemental architecture. I enjoyed the way that things were reduced to their essential, and I enjoyed the way that experience was exaggerated and amplified. I enjoyed the way that the normal was made special. These interests remained fundamental to my work and underline a concern for the experiential dimension of architecture. However modest this little house was, it attracted the anger of all the neighbors that live in the surrounding buildings, and the planners who objected to having a modern house in this suburban, rather petit bourgeois street. And so while in Japan, I had the opportunity to build things that, as long as they conformed to building regulations, no one really minded what they looked like. I was quite surprised, this was 1980s, to find what an incredible resistance there was, certainly in England at the time, to modern architecture. That was something that I really was unprepared for. There were letters to Prince Charles. There were attempts to stop the project. I mean, it was a tiny little building, but because it was, because it was modern, and because there's such an uncomfortable relationship between modern architecture and the typical London homeowner, this became a sort of battle. This awareness became even more explicit with my first major commission, a project for a museum that had no money, no collection, no director, and a site where the local population didn't want a building. I thought that once I won a competition, my professional career was off and running. But once I won this competition, it was disappointing to find that they had no money, and that, again, there was an incredible local resistance to any sort of modern building. And that resistance was profound. It wasn't just a procedure. It was something that was really fundamental. That the people of this area, and I have to say, it is It is a sensitive location. It's next to the river, and it's in a very conservative and affluent town, commuting distance of London. And they were absolutely not prepared to accept a modern building. And in a way, I think this was, these two experiences, which were quite parallel. On the one hand, in Japan, the sort of freedom to actually explore abstraction in a way free of architectural language, or free of concerns of architectural language. And then, nearly at the same time, to discover that in another context, in an English context, in an Anglo-Saxon context, what architecture looked like was profoundly important. And that modernism, which at this point was probably at its lowest moment, had really squandered the relationship that existed between architecture and the general public. And by this point, one has to really admit, certainly in England, that modern architecture had not left much evidence of quality. And therefore, everybody's default position about architecture, modern architecture, was a negative one. That anything that was going to be newly built was bound to be worse than what was there before. And in a way, it made me think very strongly about why we had found ourselves, why architects had found themselves in this dysfunctional relationship, and what modern architecture had done. And it was quite, this project forced me to confront that. There's no way that we would have built the building, we would have got permission to build the building unless we had somehow developed a strategy. So I sort of realized that the building had to have, to use Moson's phrase, a sort of familiarity. It had to engage not just the strange, but in a way the familiar. And to that end, I adopted a roof silhouette that was familiar to the barns of Oxfordshire, was familiar to the boat houses along the Thames. This is along the River Thames. And I adopted materials that were known. This is green oak. So there was a sort of subterfuge, in a way, that my ambition was to say, well, why can't... It made me confront the concept that why can't you make modern architecture that could be acceptable to not an otherwise negative general population? And why can't architecture deal with this this gap, this idea that we're making buildings that people find difficult to empathize with? Why can't buildings generate some sort of empathy within the normal, the non-architects? And it was interesting. It was shortlisted for the Mies van der Rohe Prize, and I hate to admit it, it was one of Prince Charles's favorite buildings. So I can say that now. I didn't want to talk too much about it at the time. But I think it was really crucial in my work. This project, although it's a flawed early building, I think that confrontation between what we as architects believe modern architecture should be and what the general public expect, in a way. The dialogue between those two positions, I think, is something that we have to deal with. And this was, 25 years ago, and it was something that I think that moment, I think, has been very important, and even to the Noise Museum, which I will talk about. A project we did in Berlin, a house, the desire to ensure an explicit... So one of the things that I learned in the Rohe Museum project was the materiality of the building. The fact that the building was made out of wood, and that the texture of the building and the dimensions and the way that the building was put together, the sort of legibility of the materiality, was something that endeared people and allowed people a way in and allowed people to project some affection onto it. And therefore, this idea of materiality, which I think is something which is so, that modern architecture struggles with increasingly, was important. This is a building, our first building in Germany, a house for a politician, made of brick, handmade brick. And so I will read, "The desire to ensure an explicit material physicality runs through our work and directs our attitude to form as well as materiality. These conventional values seem to be increasingly at odds with the values imposed on the production of architecture. Architecture is slow and with few exceptions is meant to last. Architecture is grounded by the mud it sits in and struggles to find an identity in a society impatient for the new, where the virtual seems real and where notions of permanence seem to contradict the spirit of the time." I want to talk a little bit about context. In a way, so many of the concerns that we have in our office are generated by the fact that we are often working in sensitive environments, either historic towns. This is Innsbruck, an important historic street, the most important street in Innsbruck, or sensitive sites. I mean, I think that this need to find continuity is, in a way, at odds with the sort of modernist agenda, but it's something which I think we need to deal with. We no longer carry the agenda of giving form to a new future or the need to disconnect ourselves from the past. The denial of history and place is no longer an idea, only a habit. We must believe in progress, but we must be careful that this doesn't only express itself in the desire for new forms, and that the appetite for the spectacular only reflects a residual longing for the heroic at the cost of the humane. Architecture is rarely radical. Technical innovation is more modest than we would like to admit. Neither is architecture quite the agent of social change that modernism imagined. Architecture follows money and power. It doesn't get far without them. Architects work in an environment that we might describe as subversive complicity. What do I mean by that? I think that so much energy that as architects, as a profession, we generate so much of our energy as in a sort of position of opposition. We think that we are, in a way, innovative. We're finding new things, and I think that obsession has tended to concern itself more with the generation of innovation in terms of form more than in substance. And as part of that dialogue, it seems to me that we tend to increasingly surrender our concern and our care about how buildings are made and about how they feel. How do we argue for quality and the quieter aspects of architecture in a culture increasingly overwhelmed by the virtual? It is one of our predicaments that the conventional organization of a project tends to isolate the architect as the lonely guardian of quality, cornered by the other more pressing and quantifiable concerns of project management, time and money. In this predicament, we struggle without evidence to fight for invisible qualities that finally can only be felt by their absence. What I mean is that the qualities that finally might make a building powerful in its presence are not ones that we can really communicate at the beginning. It's much easier to communicate images of form than it is about realities of matter. I mean, it's very difficult with a client to argue that we should use this material, not this material, because this material will make the building feel so much stronger, or that this material will have such a, or this detail or that. I mean, it's very difficult to force those points, even with a reasonable client. If something is more expensive or more complicated, then it's quite difficult before it exists. It's a different case once it exists. It's very easy. If we were making architecture before we had to explain it to our clients or to planners, it would be much easier, because then we would have evidence. But physical evidence is very difficult to suggest beforehand. And it's my position that we've tended to replace that ability with an ability to promise things more exciting and in a way more realizable, which is image. In this predicament, we struggle without evidence. This fight for building substance is one of our most important battles, critical for the premise of architecture and paradoxically critical to the public estimation of architecture. The quality that we all fight so hard for is really only understood with the final result. The loss of explicit materiality in modern architecture contributes to the general dissatisfaction that the public holds towards it. The pervasive influence of the virtual world has undermined our confidence and our judgment of physical qualities. Our heads are more turned by the more obvious attraction of image rather than the vague qualities of substance. In a risk-averse world, the speculative image has paradoxically become a guarantee. The virtual seems more believable than the real. I want to talk a bit about materiality. The realization of architecture within the tendencies of the contemporary construction industry conspire against the achievement of qualities that are conventionally valued in architecture: tactility, durability, substance. Contemporary construction tends towards prefabrication, panelization, speed of construction, and tends to be more than shy about relying on craftsmanship on the construction site. In other words, we are fighting not only the battles I've already talked about, which is this sort of idea of promise to clients and those that might commission us, but the other fight we have is with a construction industry that is under pressure itself to reduce reduce risk, and to make the process of construction as efficient as possible. Speed of construction becomes something so critical to a building, and yet within its lifespan, it's a tiny, whether a building takes 18 months or 24 months to build seems rather pathetic when you think it's got to last for 100 years. But that pressure of time imposes itself in the way that we build. And it also imposes itself, I think, in the way that we think about buildings and the way that we are allowed to think about buildings. It seems no longer possible to trust the process of construction to deliver physical reward. It is now the task of the architect to anticipate the forces that conspire against the quality of building substance. So, in a way, we tend now to think about buildings as things which are clad. When we talk about materiality, we tend to talk about cladding more than what they're made of. And I'm going to now talk about Berlin Museum, and I'm just flicking through a number of recent projects where we are, with different materials, trying to deal with materiality and substance, and in a way working with construction, the issues of contemporary construction. Some more successful than others. I have to say, building in glass is much more difficult, than building in concrete, let's say. But and also, we are continuously now having to think about building in cultures where building technologies are fragile. This is in China, a project we did in China, where again, one has to really coax what is possible and understand what can be done, it becomes one of the challenges for architects that are working in different cultures to work out what you can achieve in different places. Okay. So now, Berlin. This is the museum island. Those of you know Berlin, this is Unter den Linden here, so the Brandenburg Gate is up here somewhere. This is the main east-west axis of historical Berlin, which used to terminate on the old castle, the Schloss, which was here. This is Schenkel's bridge. And with the destruction of the Schloss after the war, it was badly bombed after the war, allowed the GDR, the East German state, to build a new palace, the Palace of the People, here. A sort of vandalism in a way, to knock down a building that was ruined, which was badly bombed, but it could have been reconstructed. But it sat too uncomfortably as a symbol of previous culture. But as we know, the East German Palace of the Republic, which was it was an extraordinarily ugly building, but it was an extraordinary building as well. It was a seat of government and also a building that contained bowling alleys and dance halls and all sorts of things. So it was a unique typology. That proved to be as uncomfortable for the new unified Germany as a symbol of the communist state as the Schloss was for the communist state. So that also has been destroyed with the excuse that it contained asbestos. They will now reconstruct a facsimile copy of the historical Schloss. So in its ridiculous revision of history, we will finally end up again with a synthetic copy of history. This here is Schenkel's Alters Museum, wonderful museum, the first two-story museum facing the castle. Here's the cathedral. Humboldt University is here. The army barracks were here. So this is really the center of the Prussian Empire. So that's Alters Museum. Here is the Neues Museum, the Pergamon, the Bode, and the National Gallery. While I'm on this, I just explained that after Schenkel built the Alters Museum, his student Stuller built the Neues Museum and this colonnade and the master plan, including the Old National Gallery. Because of the placement of the Alters Museum, these two buildings had, in a way, a sort of peripheral position, but they established a connection along this axis between the Alters Museum and the cathedral to this wonderful device, which is the colonnade, the Kolonnadenhof, which makes a garden here, and from that garden, so it's like a hall. You enter here. This is a sort of infrastructure, which then brings you to the front door of Neues Museum or the front door of the National Gallery. And by that device, these two museums were connected to this primary infrastructure. The two other museums, the Pergamon and the Bode, have no connection to the south. They're connected off of the island, and that's one of the fundamental problems for the museum island. But the competition that was held first in 1994, after the wall came down, the unification of Germany meant, of course, the unification of Berlin. The unification of Berlin meant the unification of the city, but also all of its infrastructures, drainage, underground subway systems, transport systems, but also cultural infrastructure. Because at that point, of course, Berlin had grown up, had developed two parallel cultural systems. And now, after 1989, there was a possibility of reunification of those collections, and the museum island became once again the important destination for the archaeological collections. And All of the buildings had been repaired after the war, with the exception of the Noise Museum. Sorry. I'm going to come back. Oh, well, you can see there. So this is where the Schloss will be built. Here's Unter den Linden. There's the castle. There's the cathedral, Altes Museum, Neues Museum, our new entrance building, which is here, and then the National Gallery here. When I will explain a little bit about why the Noise Museum was never restored. It remained a ruin since the war until 1997, when we won the competition, but it had spent nearly coming on for 60 years as a ruin, while the other buildings had been repaired and functioned again as museums. We won the competition to restore the building, and I will talk about that. You can see at this point how it's still, there are huge parts of it missing, and I will explain that. When we won the competition, there was an expectation that the Noise Museum would become a sort of connection between the southern buildings of the Museum Island and the northern buildings of the Museum Island. It would become a sort of, because it was a ruin and because it had the flexibility to be changed, the museums had imagined that perhaps that's where they could put all the things that the Museum Island doesn't have. They could put an auditorium in there and coffee shops and all sorts of things, and also they could connect between the two sets of buildings. I argued against that, saying that this building wasn't capable of being restored and to take on the additional responsibilities of doing that. And so we developed a new master plan, and this diagram shows the concept of the master plan, which is that all the buildings are connected at the basement level, between the Altes and the Noise and the Pergamon and the Bode. And there, as part of that process, there will be a new building here which will cope with all of the new infrastructural elements that the Museum Island requires. These buildings were all 19th and early 20th, Pergamon was early 20th century, but the other buildings were 19th century buildings. They were museum buildings built without the expectations that a modern museum has. In fact, the Noise Museum has a bell. You used to come to the front of the Noise Museum, you'd ring a bell and someone would open the door for you. And then they would take your coat and then you would wander around. I mean, that's not the sort of, we're now expecting between 5 and 6 million visitors a year. So ringing bells isn't part of the entrance procedure. So we have to think in a very different way on the Museum Island how to do that. And so this has come up with an idea that takes the pressure off of Noise Museum, doesn't ask the Noise Museum to do things that it can't do, and instead puts them here. So before I talk about the new Noise Museum, I just want to talk about this building, which is now on site. Well, not this building, but just briefly about the process. While we were restoring the Noise Museum, which was a project of 11 years, the feasibility of a new building on the west side of Noise Museum, exactly where Schenkel's Packhof buildings used to sit, was tested. And this was an early project to test that feasibility, both in functionality, practicality, and also in terms of cost. And this project sort of went into the public realm and was floated around without very much reaction. There was not the money to build it, and so there was not much threat. A number of years later, I think now about 5 years ago, all of a sudden the money was available to build the building, and a debate then ensued about what this building should be and what it should look like. And it was clear to me that in the intervening years, while this project had been useful as a sort of testing, it hadn't really confronted what it wanted to be or what it needed to be, and also hadn't found real opposition compared to the opposition, for instance, that we had managed to provoke on the Noise Museum, but it hadn't really found much support. And so we had the opportunity to rethink the project. We took the first project as a feasibility, and then we started again. And we were interested in this idea of the colonnade, and in a way the landscape of the museum island being made of these sort of giant staircases. I mean, it's a sort of urban scale architecture. So here's the great, the entrance risalit of the Noise Museum at the front door. This colonnade runs all the way around there. So that was interesting. This is actually the restored Noise Museum colonnade. This runs to the front door. So the colonnade became interesting for us. This is the restored Noise Museum with the colonnade replaced and our gallery building there. Just like. And then, of course, the most wonderful building of the museum, mine and Schenkel's Altes Museum, and this extraordinary portico and the steps. And this drawing, which shows, people, citizens wandering around within this temple of culture, and there is the Lustgarten, there's the Schloss, and there's Schenkel's church across the other side. And you realize, actually, that these people are inside a building, but they've never really gone through a door. So that this portico and the whole concept of the Altes Museum was one of sort of transparency. That this threshold between inside and outside was formed only by this portico, not by any other device. And this becomes a sort of public, a very exclusive but actually very public space. And this is a sketch that's not going to mean very much, but if you imagine this is that's the pergamon and that's the silhouette of the Noise Museum. This is a sketch I did when we sort of reconvened and said, look, these glass boxes, it's not the right interpretation of what the building wants to be. And I did the sketch sort of saying what we really want is a sort of Miesian National Gallery space on a sort of socle, on a base. And this should be the sort of representational room. So we then became fascinated in this idea of the colonnade and the idea that the colonnade might be extended. So that this building could disappear. It shouldn't become a series, a sort of building which relies on its opposition as a modernist building in face of, despite of the historical context. But it should be a building that somehow dialogues with history, but not necessarily by adopting a sort of literal language, but by understanding and extending and exaggerating the devices which already exist there. So there's a socle, a base, which continues the base of the pergamon. There's a colonnade, which runs around and continues the colonnade, which is there. And there's this sort of temple device, reminiscent of the portico, which becomes, in a way, the representative body of the building. So that's how it pans out. So it sits as a so it's transformed itself from an architectural proposition, which in a way was a sort of classic modernist pose, a strategy of saying, you make an abstract architecture in opposition to a historic language, and that we've, in a way, gone full circle and started to think, well, how can we engage architectural language? Because I think that this particular context is somewhere where one has to think about language and the expectations of what we think architecture should look like. And I think that's a theme that's very important to our work increasingly is that making buildings that just look strange is one strategy, but I think there are many conditions, and this being one where that doesn't actually help us, and instead we have to start to consider ways of dealing with the familiar and the unfamiliar, trying to find an architecture which is somehow bridging between, as Mosen said in the introduction, between the familiar and the unexpected. And this building really tries to walk that line between something which is, in one sense, grounded in the history of the other buildings and in the language of colonnade and portico and urban staircases, and on the other hand, something which has been reduced and elementalized to a very extreme and quite radical degree. And that in itself is also strengthened by the way that you build it, that this becomes a sort of tectonic idea as well, that the columns are structure, that they are elemental not only in their appearance, but they've also literally loaded with structure, but also loaded in a sort of archaic elemental manner as architectural elements. So 5 minutes left to do 11 years work. Noise Museum, the entrance side, so the east side, the Noise Museum faced the east. That was its entrance. The back was to the west because the back was covered by Schenkel's warehouse buildings. It faced the east onto the colonnade courtyard, as I showed you before. After the war, so you can see by the cards, this was still, probably I think this was a photograph, late 50s, early 60s. The Noise Museum already a ruin, trees already growing inside the building at that point. Everything else sort of repaired. The same looking from the west side. So this is where the entrance building is going to sit. That's the Kupfergraben Canal here. The building completely lost the northwest corner courtyard. A bomb took out a large piece of the facade here and all of these rooms all the way through to the ground floor. The southeast corner is completely missing, and that's the staircase hall, which you can see also was completely destroyed. The building was stabilized during the GDR period. There were attempts and discussions continuously about its restoration. But it stayed as a ruin. And paradoxically, in 1988, the stabilization works had been completed, and they were about to start a synthetic reconstruction, a copy of the old building, when the events of history intervened and the unification of Germany stopped that happening. So the new unified Germany was left with this ruin. And just a little bit about ruins. What was extraordinary about, we worked for, the competition actually straddled 3 or 4 years. It was in two stages. It was aborted. There was an early competition in 1994. It was then aborted, and there was another competition in 1997, which we won. So we'd spent a lot of time in the building, and so had many other people. And everybody was impressed with the power of the ruin. There's something very endearing about a ruin. A ruin brings, brings architecture close to us, I think. And this is a beautiful photograph by Roger Fenton of Rievaulx Abbey, and you can see here this romantic idea we have of ruins, and in a way, I think it's the idea that ruination has brought architecture nearly into a sort of natural state, that you get the feeling that architecture and nature sit comfortably together, that, architecture has become nature. And that's a very beautiful idea in a way. And of course, Caspar David Friedrich said the idea of the ruin is always fascinating for all the things that it carries with it. And this is an extraordinary set of drawings I'm going to show you. This is Gandhi drawing, a draftsman of Sir John Soane, or a painter that was commissioned by Sir John Soane to draw the Bank of England project, his own project, as a ruin. So while he is designing and building the Bank of England, his greatest project, he's asking Gandhi to draw what it will be like as a ruin, as if the ruin condition is its most noble state, and in a way the greatest test of a building. Like Michelangelo said, the great test of a piece of sculpture is to roll it down the mountain and see what's left at the bottom. It's the same with architecture in a way. What's left out of ruination, that's the test of great architecture. And even more interesting, here's Gandhi also drawing one of the halls of the Bank of England before it's built. So this is, our version of a computer-generated image. And this is the image of the same hall in raw construction. So in a way, a sort of pre-ruin. So, and I think, this looks like Louis Kahn. I mean, this is as modern as architecture gets, and also physical. And I think what's interesting about that, and this is, in a way, the theme I want to talk about, that the ruination or the state of architecture before it's sort of highly decorated is closer, allows us a sort of proximity to the physical qualities of architecture. And that's what we all felt in the Neues Museum. And of course, in Germany, the meaning of ruins has, and the whole of Europe after the war, the status of ruin and the idea of memorial, or what one does with ruins. This is Eiermann's great project in the church in the Gedankeskirche in the Kurfürstendamm in Berlin, where he was forced to keep the tower and build next to it his project. This is the Frauenkirche in Dresden. That was what was left of the great cathedral in Dresden, with the Unification. Helmut Kohl promised the citizens of Dresden that it would be rebuilt, and there it is today, completely rebuilt. So a completely different attitude for different reasons, understandably. I think the silhouette of the Frauenkirche is so necessary for Dresden, for this wonderful sort of river silhouette, so one can understand why it's in. It's quite convincing, I must say. Inside it's quite horrible, but because it's where it becomes very difficult to recreate. So within this tradition of rebuilding and dealing with ruins, what would our references be? And in a way, the most interesting work that was done in Germany was the work done immediately after the war. Since then, I must say, restoration reconstruction has become super conservative, and everybody basically wants to see a copy of what was lost. But in the shadow of the war, this is Dolgast rebuilding the Pinakothek in Munich with the austerity of materials. He matched the facade, building it in a sort of stripped version, not trying to copy, but on the other hand, give continuity. And this project became the project. It was our reference project, and it was the project we borrowed. And of course, we were building a museum for the archaeological collections, so it was an argument that I could make with the archaeologists, and I explained to them that the fragments of the Greek urn, when they sit on the table, have very little meaning. They're fascinating because of their history, but we can't understand what they mean. If we put them back together, we can predict, or we can extrapolate how they sat in relationship to each other. So the fragments, each fragment can be, in a way, given meaning again within an overall form. That's not so difficult. But what we don't do is to start copying horses' tails and, people's legs and all of that. So that's something that in archaeology, in the restoration of paintings, it's completely understood. So why shouldn't we do the same in architecture? Why would we take a different attitude to architecture? Of course, it's a slightly different problem. How to find the equivalent. If we have architectural fragments, in a way, what's the equivalent of that stuff? What's the equivalent of the gypsum, which is holding and giving body back to something which is so broken? I'm going to speed up a bit. So the concept, this is a sketch in the competition, where I said the first responsibility is to re-establish the form. So much of the building was left, a bit like the Greek vase, that there is so much. I mean, if there was not that amount left, of course, one might think about a different strategy. But the idea of completion, recompleting the form, seemed to me really critical. And more than that, also the spatial sequence, because unlike the urn, these fragments contain rooms inside them, and these rooms had a sequence and an expectation about what room led to another. So they made sense in the historical plan. So we had to think about that as well, obviously. So that's a pretty easy step. But then how to do it, and where does that take one? Very briefly, this is the status of the building as we inherited it. So you can see an unbelievably inconsistent ruination. So places where we really still had, architectural elements, some decoration, and some architectural space. But other places where, that's the same area of the building. You can see that we've lost so much. Although other rooms where we really still we have most of it left. We have the architectural volume, we have the architectural elements, and we have the decorative surfaces. One of the reasons that the building was not restored earlier was because as an early 19th century museum, Berlin didn't have an incredible collection of objects. Most of the pieces in the collection were casts. The building was a sort of encyclopedic illustration of civilization. And the room decorations, the decorations on the walls, were part of the story and were part of the exhibit. They were the running themes that went through. So the damage that happened to the wall decoration was fundamental to the building, and that was an intellectual struggle that in the proposals that suggested the whole building should be copied again as if nothing had happened to the building. The reachievement of the decorative surfaces, these frescoes and these illustrations, not only was technically difficult, but in a way, philosophically, completely out of step with what a contemporary museum wants to be. And in fact, much of that decoration had already been vandalized before the war happened. But you can see in this room, this is the vestibule, that while some of the surface is broken, the rest is there. We've got all the elements. These are the rooms before we start. But again, some places you can see, a massive amount of decorative material and architectural detail still there. And other places of the building, it's completely lost, 100% lost. So the damage was completely inconsistent, and yet we wanted to make a singular building. There is a sort of modernist approach to this problem, which is a sort of yin and yang, where you you isolate very clearly. I mean, Carlo Scarpa played this game very strongly. That you gave great recognition to the new pieces, and you caricaturized the new and the old. But because this building had suffered such substantial damage, and I didn't want to make two buildings, I wanted to make one building, therefore I wanted these two things to come together. How did we do it? So we photographed every surface of the building. I should say that in this process, we worked very closely with a restoration architect called Julian Harp. He was part of the team, and we couldn't have done this without him, and he introduced these techniques to us. We photographed every surface, every floor, every window frame. This is the 4 panels of one ceiling. This is a vaulted ceiling in the Roman room. These are curved barrel vaults, quite flat barrel vaults. And most damage was done at this end, and you can see this is how the pattern was. And just so what we did, we photographed every surface, and then on the computer we speculated about how we might then suppress that damage. If our idea was to preserve every piece of original material, which is where we started from, like the Greek vase, you protect and clean every piece of original material. The question is then, how do you link those things together, and more importantly, how do you stop it becoming a sort of only a romantic expression of damage? Because it wasn't the damage that we were interested in highlighting, it was what remained that we were interested in. So on a sort of computer program, we looked at, and sometimes we would do 20 iterations of this, and sometimes we'd go too far, and then we'd come back again. Then that would be transferred onto construction drawings. That would be given to the restorers, and then the restorers would try to achieve what we wanted to do, and then we get the reality. Another example, the same process, trying to work out how much we needed to do to frame the damage, and in a way to put the damage further back, and to give the identity to the room, give an identity back to the room without losing the character of the original building. We didn't want to lose the original material. We didn't want to lose the physicality that the ruin offered us. So, three-dimensional example of how that process happened. So you can see at the end, it's an enormous transformation from that, but in essence, we're trying to hold on to the qualities, the physical qualities are there, and without drowning the qualities that we found. So as the building, this is the North Dome room. A lot of the damage was done not by bombs, but actually in the subsequent 50 years by water damage, water penetration. This was all damage done by water, computer simulation, the real thing. The most challenging thing was the staircase. That was the original. That was how it was after the war. And we spent 1 year working with, you can imagine this, there was an enormous interest in this project. And it was in the public realm. There was a huge discussion about and disagreement about the approach. There was a huge lobby that wanted the building to be a copy of what it was and didn't want to accept my strategy of what we called a soft restoration. But at the same time, there was also, so there was that happening, but at the same time, you have to understand that this is done within the German, it's a state project, so every decision had to be approved, every decision had to be discussed and ratified. So there is, a million decisions on this project, which all had to be explained and approved. So the process of collaboration was enormous. The discussion about the staircase was a discussion for more than 1 year. The museums were very interested in us coming up with a more radical, because this was the most damaged part of the building, why couldn't we do, why shouldn't we do a modern intervention here? And we spent 1 year making all sorts of alternatives, but finally we realized, in a way I think reassuringly, that the room only made sense with the form of the historic stair. And so what we did was we put the form back, and we obviously didn't try to copy the decoration of the original, but the whole dimension. I mean, we started to learn that the dimension of the rooms, the way that you walk up towards the light, turn and go back up towards the light, the cubic qualities, the spatial sequence in the building, I mean, it all made sense with the stair, and it didn't make sense without the stair. You can see in these sections a sort of combination of old spaces and new spaces that we had to continuously, we were interested in the building, not just a series of fragments, but always reminding ourselves that it had to add up again to a singular building. This section shows that's the North Dome room where Nefertiti now sits, and I showed you the drawings of that. We lost this corner completely, but we wanted to build a cupola on the outside because it was important for the facade. And we decided that we should somehow remember the dome space, but we should build a sort of contemporary and sort of physical version. We did a 1:5 scale model because we couldn't work out, this is a classic architectural problem of building a dome onto a square base. I mean, architects have been trying to do this have been doing this for thousands of years, and we were sort of trying to work out how to do it ourselves. And what you must know is that if you take a cross-section that way, it's an ellipse. If you take it that way, it's a semicircle. So therefore, this brick course has to go up and then down again. And we couldn't work out how to draw this or how to specify it. So we made a 1:5 model, which is about 6 foot tall. It took us months to make, to try and work out how to do it. And then the brick company came. In fact, they'd been working on the Frauenkirche in Dresden. And they looked at the model and said, well, we know how to do it. We don't need the model. And they did it. And they did it very convincingly without the model. So there was an enormous, there were petitions. This is a poster against the project, basically saying, do you want the beautiful 19th century hall, or do you want Chipperfield's horrible version of it? And I had to keep arguing that I can't give you, this. We've lost this. It's not there anymore, and we can't get it back. It's a great shame. We should have been more careful. But against the protests, and there were significant protests, and I must say, if you ever want to make a big protest, do it at night with candles, because it's so picturesque and it looks like an enormous protest. That's what the people against this project did. It was on the front of every newspaper. Every politician was unnerved. UNESCO flew in because they thought it was a problem. But when we opened the building for a soft opening, quite charming. I must say that this is great tribute to the Berliners who had been skeptical. They're asking people here, before they go in, they're asking what do they think, and most of them are saying, well, let me have a look first, and I'll tell you. And then, when they come out, they're asking them. And there were 10,000 people queuing for 6 hours to go through it. So it was a complete, the reaction was quite extraordinary. And I think, in a way, the struggle that we set ourselves, this idea of trying to to keep history and keep the traces, not as a war monument, not as any didactic idea of there are no lessons. It's about the object. I just said I was, treating this as an object that we had to protect. And of course, more complicated to do on external surfaces it was on internal. And then these are the last. So finally, a few slides of the completed. That's it. Thank you very much.
We have time for some questions. I think there's some mics around if anyone. I think there are a lot of issues that have been put on the table, and it would be really great to at least try and address some of them. I think at the beginning, just because of the fact that we are in the context of a school, you were quite emphatic about, in a sense, a sort of gentle argument against innovation and the value of, or the reality of slowness in terms of architecture, and in a sense, a kind of critical perspective in relation to image.
Not against innovation, but innovation with the counterbalance of restraint, right, and of continuity. That, not innovation as an end to itself.
Right. So I think in terms of the model discussion for the museum with the new part, I think that probably does somehow deal with this. But I'm just wondering, how do you deal in the context of the office in terms of the relationship with clients, in terms of the idea of architecture communicating to others during the process of design, your ideas which are sometimes not so easily communicated because of the fact that they do rely so much on the importance of construction. So one of the things that you seem to do is to make larger models. But how do you deal with this idea of the relationship between construction, communicability, and the connection between practice and the client?
Well, I think we do lose a lot of competitions because our work looks boring. I mean, there's no, if you don't spend a lot, if you're less, if extravagant form is not something that you're necessarily completely convinced of in all situations, and I have to say, in a way, we do find ourselves a lot in context. I mean, I suppose you nearly end up sleeping in the bed you make for yourself, because we've demonstrated we can handle complicated historical environments. We tend to get asked a lot into historical complicated environments. So, which we enjoy. I enjoy that. And of course, I think all of us are. I mean, I think all architects probably enjoy a richer context to play with than a poorer context. I mean, building a new building in a docklands without any other building to be seen is a much more challenging task than building in the center of Innsbruck. Well, it's maybe not more challenging, but it's got a very different request to it. And in some sense, of course, the architectural volume, the noise of the architecture probably needs to be stronger as the context is weaker. If you can rely on context, then you can be quieter. If you can't rely on context, then probably you've got to be noisier. And I suspect that is also, it's a situation that we also have to understand, that so much contemporary work at the moment is being done in developing cultures, or cultures that are developing cities and building very fast, whether it's China or the Middle East, So at that point, you're inventing out of, you're building in the desert or you're building a new city. Therefore, my sort of position about the, architectural form, I do accept that that we are fascinated by those environments, and that those environments are affecting our view of architecture. But it's not a view that can be translated, universally.
So I'm wondering, how do you evaluate then in that kind of context, given the fact that you rely so much on the nuances, on the things that are probably much harder to notice compared to big moves of imagery. So how do you establish certain value systems for yourself in terms of the progress that you may be making in the office from one kind of project to another? What are the criteria?
Result, whether something is apparent or not. I think that in a way architecture is not ambiguous in that way. If something is evident physically, then you've achieved something. And I actually think, in our pessimistic moments, we can say that people are immune to that difference, that they can't tell the difference between something done well or something. They can't tell whether something has physical quality or not. In one's optimistic moments, I actually disagree with it. And I think that was what was very interesting about Neues Museum. I would have to say that Neues Museum, as it is possible in Germany, it is possible to do construction at a very, very high level. It's much more difficult in the Anglo-Saxon cultures. Both here and in UK, we have a much more powerful construction industry that's very reluctant to do things. In Germany, you can do it. In Switzerland, even easier. But I would say that one of the things which gave me so much confidence out of Neues Museum was the fact that people could identify the physical quality, not just of the fact that we left bits of brickwork exposed, but that even the new things were done, and they're built absolutely beautifully. And I think that was very important to the concept. So I think I'm still confident that people can tell the difference between things.
Any volunteers? I can keep asking. Okay, there's a hand back there. While you're reaching, maybe I can just ask one other question, and then I think we've got someone who's got. So I think for those people who've seen the building, it's really an extraordinary tour de force, just in terms of how you deal with the issue of conservation, how you deal with preservation. And specifically, I think what's really extraordinary is the way that you rely not on the idea of replication, but really creating, in a sense, a kind of atmosphere on a lot of the interiors and surfaces that does what you said you wanted to do, which is to create a kind of unity, not to create a kind of conflictual relationship between old and new. But I was struck by your reference to one of the images where you started talking about damage. And you said you didn't really want to show damage. And I'm wondering whether you had to struggle yourself with the whole idea of how the creation of that unity that you were talking about is itself a kind of erasure of damage. And for a lot of people, presumably, the presence of the damage is also an important recognition of a certain history. So I'm wondering whether you feel there are sort of philosophical conflicts where people would consider that in some ways the concept of conservation also creates a new history through this process of erasure in some way, and therefore somehow wants to forget about the memory of, for example, what happened during the war.
Yeah,
Is that a problem
it's not a
with
memorial.
conservation?
I mean, it was very important that this was not a memorial, that we were making a building and a museum. And actually, by the way, we had to integrate air conditioning and lighting, which the original building never had, which was like air conditioning, you know, Pompeian ruin. I mean, we couldn't do it, we refused to do it by adding false ceilings or any of those things. So it's an unbelievably complicated process to do that. But we wanted to make a new building out of the old. We weren't, there is a difference, I think, between showing damage and giving evidence to something the building's been through. And there is no honesty in this building. I mean, there's not one surface which is, if you like, original. I mean, even the exposed brickwork walls, we manicured those. I mean, they are, you know, all of the bad bricks that were put in by the GDR to stabilize the wall, we had to take out. All the things which were so crumbly that they would have come out, we had to put. So every surface is sort of played with. Because what was important wasn't, you know, and we found ourselves often, and it was quite interesting because, of course, there were a number of lessons for me which were very important. First of all, that the importance of I mean, it was a project where the physicality was something that everybody bought into and was evident from the beginning. So instead of having a project on your table and saying, it's going to be a wonderful physical place, you had a physical place and say, it is a wonderful physical place, let's not lose it. So you could get buy-in on that, and that was very important. The second was that in Germany, there is respect for idea. And that was the dominant discussion. This was a fight for 10 years, but it was a fight about ideas. And that doesn't happen in the Anglo-Saxon, you know, world in that way. And that was fantastic. And therefore, what we discussed all the time was the meaning of things. And what did it mean to do this? And I think that was the other thing, was that it was a project that really involved collaboration of everybody, from the historic preservation department to people from the Ministry of Finance, everybody. I had to persuade everybody. And that was a fantastic architectural experience that so often in architectural projects, everybody's fighting everybody. And of course, there were big fights here. But the general attitude was a collaboration, and that meant that you could do things. And sorry, staying closer to your question, I think that there was a distinction between the result, giving evidence to what this building had been through, being a different thing than just sort of saying, it's a ruin, let's keep it as a ruin. Because that's not what we were doing. That wasn't the idea. The idea was to make a new building. It wasn't to keep the old one and to add some new bits to it. It was really to make a new building out of the old and out of the history of it. All of its histories. I mean, that was the important thing. The history of the original building was also something we had an incredible responsibility to.
Right. Please go ahead. Could I also just see if there are any other people who would like to ask questions? Maybe you can raise your hand so they can give you the mic. Please, go ahead. Yeah.
I got a hold of a secondhand book, which was Gropius's Bauhaus's course of study. And at the back of the book was a reference to Schenkel. And apparently, Gropius was a student of Schenkel. And Schenkel was of a group of was a German architect who basically had sort of a school of architecture that is associated with it, with his family. And it's interesting to see the images of Schenkel juxtaposed against what could be a modernist rendition, but isn't necessarily so, because it didn't seem to really go there in this museum complex. But there was one picture that you showed, which was of the Schenkel building in the interior courtyard space, which was
You're going to ask
the balcony, the balcony,
which was an indication of interpenetrating space. So what I'm wondering is, how does Schenkel influence modernism through Gropius when he's actually apparently a neoclassicist?
Well, I mean, he influenced more than Gropius. I mean, he was an influence to Mies van der Rohe in a very literal way, and Mies was very, very influenced by the Altos Museum when he, I think there are two things here. One is that what I tried to explain in the lecture was, when I did the Rowing Museum in England all those years ago, I confronted something that I wasn't prepared for, and I was never taught in school, which was the reaction of, or the resistance of the general public. And I'd always been taught that that was a resistance you should trample on, because it's a resistance of ignorance. And modernism had a bigger agenda that was needed to be exercised. But by the time I was practicing architect in the 80s, it was very difficult to be a sort of evangelical modernist, because the evidence of around us was quite difficult to defend. So in some sense, you felt that the voice of resistance was a voice that you had to sort of at least listen to. And I think that voice was about architectural language, and it was about the fact that amongst all of these other things, where we as a profession had convinced ourselves that architecture should look like what it wanted to be, that function gave form and all sorts of other things, and that if you ended up with an ugly building, that's, but it was honest, that didn't matter. I started to feel in that at that time, that there was another voice, and that voice had to be listened to. And I have to say, this coincided with sort of postmodernism in a way. Further down the line, working in Germany in a number of contexts, I've also felt that architectural language is really critical, that it's not something that you can sidestep, that you can just somehow avoid. And, of course, if you start lining columns up, I mean, it becomes, in a way, neoclassical in some sense. So, but I think the issue there wasn't necessarily one literally of being influenced by Schenkel, but more the idea that you had to consider architectural language, that you can't, as architects, it's probably the thing that we're most uncomfortable with. I mean, we don't know really how to explain the fundamental issue as what should our buildings look like. So we disguise that discussion in all sorts of other things. So we construct forms, and we have, all sorts of ways of justifying our constructs, whether those are functional, they're sort of high-tech, or, But it's the one thing that we are most nervous about, is why does it look like that? But all I'm saying is that I think that the expectation of normal people, I think, has to be part of that discussion. Not because that's what you should do, but in a way it has to be, you can sidestep it. You can make a building that we've never seen before, and you walk around it and you say, wow, amazing. And I think there are some extraordinary buildings. I think the Guggenheim in Bilbao is an extraordinary building. And it's a building you can't necessarily say it's about familiarity, it's about unfamiliarity. And thank God it's there. But that's one building. I mean, you can't necessarily make the whole world out of that, and that's one context. But I think that we can't only have a relationship with architecture, which is a relationship of awe. How did they do that? What's that about? I mean, I think at some point, architecture, we have to have architecture, some aspect of architecture or some quantity of architecture, which is about empathy and which is about giving us a way in, not just keeping us in admiration.
Yes, hello. You began your lecture talking about the ability to sort of sense a building and bringing the body back into architecture. And then you talked about the tensions that you encountered with a lot of your earlier projects and how to bring in the familiarity, whether that's the vernacular or a historical element. And I'm wondering how it seems that those moments were based on the visual or anchored to the visual. And I'm wondering how that relates to, and I'm hesitant to use this word, but phenomenology. And if you're dealing with historical precedents and restoration, every building sort of has a sense of baggage to it, and the contemporary context has a sense of baggage. And so how do you navigate those two terrains? And additionally, is it possible for context to be reinstated in a building beyond the mere visual?
There's a lot of questions in there, but I did try to talk about the fact that construction industry tends to bring with it pressures that push us away from conventional values of architecture. You know, the speed of construction is something that it's very difficult for us in a professional environment to ignore. Therefore, you have to have strategies about how to deal with that. And I do think that we have to think about architectural substance, not just architectural surface. And I would have to say in the Anglo-Saxon construction, industry, we've tended to be pushed more and more to the surface, that questions about structure or environmental control or how, what a building is made of and how that might become part of its character is, I think is increasingly under threat. So therefore, we have to fight for that territory. I think it's not quite so aggressive in Central Europe, let's say Switzerland and Germany. There's a more acceptance that one might play with those things. But I think it's not impossible, and I think that, I don't know how to do it, and I'm not sure we do it all the time, but I think it's something that concerns us, is how do you keep materiality and substance as part of the evidence of architecture, that is, I don't think, the idea of having to describe architecture outside of itself, I think, is rather questionable, that if you don't get it when you're at the building, then it's not there. So therefore, how do you imbue a building with that, and how do you give evidence and apparentness to those physical and spatial and formal and social ideas? Because I think that's the other thing I haven't probably talked enough about, is the fact that, finally architecture is about idea, and it has to be also about social ideas and what, yeah.
So do you think that working for more than 10 years on the museum is actually going to change your ideas about new building, like working on preservation and conservation issues? Because if you say that there is nothing, I don't know exactly what word you use, but basically the idea that the manner of creating that unity relies on also a kind of lie in some ways, because it's not about the thing being authentic, but actually with your new buildings, you argue for authenticity. And somehow Neues Museum, the interior surfaces are according to you, are not about authenticity.
I'm not saying they're not authentic, because they're physical, they're real. Yeah. And people get something from it. I'm just saying that, there's no truth.
Right.
There's no sort of, and nor is there in any, I don't think architecture is about that. I mean, philosophy might be, poetry might be, but I think architecture is just, I don't know.
So you think the manner of conception as far as the interiors of the museum are concerned are in a way following in the same traditions as when, earlier buildings for you, for example?
There's no way that we could have done Neues Museum and we could have handled 1 million decisions in the bureaucratic process with very, very intelligent people around that process if it wasn't given the direction of a clear conceptual idea. I mean, it would have just been all over the place. It would have just been a scenographic, nightmare. So there is behind there a very clear and highly articulated, and articulated within a group of people, So I'm just saying, in order to get there, you do use devices in the same way that Hitchcock, when he made films, he cheated in order to get images onto the screen. The table was put onto bricks, so the bottles were closer to the. So sometimes, in order to achieve a reality, you have to enhance things. You have to exaggerate. You have to, And I think that's something. I talked about, the experience of Japan, where experiences are heightened and intensified. And I think that that's what one is trying to do in architecture. Is intensifying the physical qualities of architecture against a tendency that we have, which is doing the opposite, because the whole of our society is interested in impermanence and ephemera, and trying to hold on to notions of permanence and and the quality of things, and it's not natural. So there's a certain resistance in that process. But I don't think one should, I think the idea of marginalizing oneself into some strange corner where you can only work under certain conditions is also dangerous. I think there are certain people, let's say, Peter Zumthor, who has really optimized that corner and done it with the most extraordinary quality, and reminds us all, the power of that. But that's a particular dedication which I'm not capable of doing. But and I think in our office we're not trying to go into that corner. We want to be viable. We want to be commissioned, and we want to prove that you can do it in a sort of mainstream way.
Maybe you can ask the last question. Yeah.
I was surprised actually that you have an office in Shanghai. Am I correct? And I'm assuming that means that you're building there. And it was surprising for me because it seems to me that your design philosophy is sort of in opposition to these forces that I see as the main forces driving the Chinese building market, which is a sort of speed and like new things rule. So I'm curious as to how you've been sort of navigating that.
Well, we spent 5 years protecting 11 buildings in the north end of the Bund. And when I take people there and I say that we did this, they say, well, what did you do? And it was a really difficult project where there's no obvious result apart from the fact that we stopped 11 reasonable buildings being knocked down because for exactly those reasons. So I think there are moments where one can bring, another point of view. I mean, it was a struggle because the Chinese are so good at copying things. Even when you say you want to keep something, they say, yes, we keep it. They knock it down, and then you say, but we wanted to keep it. Say, yeah, it's fine. Don't worry, we're going to build it again. But their idea of keeping is that you keep the design, not necessarily keep the material. Because why would you keep this old material when we can make you a new one better? And their ability to copy, as we know, is it's extreme. So it was culturally a fascinating period to try and explain to people that the fabric itself has meaning. And that was something very, very difficult to discuss. It's difficult to discuss anywhere, but it's extremely difficult to discuss in China.
David, thank you so much for really an incredible lecture.